What would you do if a man held a gun to your face, desperate and afraid? A robbery gone wrong, a life hanging in the balance. What happens when the one holding the weapon isn't a criminal, but someone pushed to the edge? Will fear drive him to violence, or can a calm voice change his fate? Find out in this intense story of survival and second chances, only here on H2 Black Thread. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. The night air in Phoenix, Arizona, always had a dry, crisp quality to it, especially as the hours ticked toward midnight. The city, known for its endless stretch of desert and sun-soaked streets, took on a different feel when the sun set. While the heat of the day died down, the night brought with it a certain kind of stillness, a quietness that seemed to envelop the streets. That quiet was amplified in some places more than others. One such place was Silver Barrel Liquor, a small, tucked-away liquor store located at the corner of 7th Avenue and Thomas Road, not far from the bustle of downtown but far enough to avoid the clamor that filled the city's heart. Here, the world slowed down, at least for a few hours every night. Silver Barrel had never been a flashy place. Its exterior was simple, with faded neon lights that barely illuminated the front window. A small sign hung above the door, its letters slowly peeling off after years of exposure to the Arizona heat. The store had been around for decades, serving both the residents of the nearby neighborhoods and the late-night wanderers seeking something to ease the loneliness of the night. Some people came in for a quick six-pack, while others lingered over cheap whiskey, finding comfort in the ritual of pouring themselves a drink after a long day. But for most, it was just a stop along the way, an anonymous space where no one had to ask questions or make small talk. Behind the counter, Tyrone Jackson had become as much a fixture of the store as the shelves lined with bottles of every variety. He'd been working at Silver Barrel for 6 months now, ever since he returned from his 4th tour of duty in Iraq. He wasn't the kind of guy who would have been on anyone's radar if they didn't know him, but that's just how he preferred it. Tyrone wasn't one to seek attention. He didn't need to stand out or make a name for himself in a place like this. The job was simple. Ring up the customers, keep the store clean and close up at the end of the night. It was a routine that gave him a sense of peace, something that had been hard to come by since he left the war behind. Tyrone's appearance was enough to make anyone wonder if he were just another tough guy passing through town, but there was more to him than the hardened exterior. At 32, he had the kind of face that seemed to have weathered years more than it should have. His dark skin was scarred from years of exposure to the harsh desert sun, and his black hair, now trimmed short, showed signs of thinning. He stood a little taller than most, his broad shoulders and lean build giving him the air of someone who had spent years on his feet, someone who had learned to carry a weight heavier than most could comprehend. His eyes, though, told a different story. They weren't just tired from long hours, but from the experiences he had endured, both in the desert and in the quiet that followed. Tyrone didn't talk much. The sounds of the store, the low hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic on the main road, and the occasional murmur of someone walking in, were enough to keep him company. The rhythm of life behind the counter was his comfort zone. The routine was predictable, which, after everything he had been through, was exactly what he needed. No surprises, no chaos, just the humdrum of everyday life. As a veteran, Tyrone found that adjusting to civilian life wasn't easy. He was used to the constant alertness, the heightened senses, the adrenaline that kept him sharp in the face of danger. But back here in Phoenix, in this liquor store, everything was so ordinary. It felt almost like a different world. The bright neon lights, the mundane conversations about the weather or the football game last Sunday, the sound of coins clinking in his hand, none of it seemed to matter. None of it had the weight of life or death hanging over it. It was just a job that kept him busy, distracted, and above all else, safe. Some might think that after 4 tours in Iraq, Tyrone would be itching to take on something more challenging. Maybe he should be doing something more meaningful, something that would honor his service. But the truth was, Tyrone didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He had been through more than most could imagine. He had been to hell and back, and now all he wanted was the silence, the absence of conflict, the peace that came with doing a simple job and heading home at the end of the day. The store's interior was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering occasionally overhead. They cast a tired yellow glow on everything in sight. The aisles were stocked with rows upon rows of bottles, cheap vodka, rum, whiskey, tequila, lined up like soldiers on display. The shelves were carefully arranged, but it was clear that this was a place that had seen its fair share of use. The floor creaked underfoot as Tyrone walked around, wiping down the counter, keeping himself busy as he waited for the night to pass. His routine was so ingrained that he didn't even have to think about it. He could do it on autopilot. But the quiet was what made him feel at ease. It was the one thing he could control in a world that had once been full of chaos. The bell above the door jingled, announcing a new arrival. Tyrone didn't look up immediately. He was used to the regulars, old men in plaid shirts who came in for their nightly bottle of bourbon, young college students grabbing a 6-pack of beer for a weekend party. But this person didn't quite fit the pattern. Tyrone's eyes flicked to the clock on the wall, 11:30 p.m. He had about half an hour left before he could lock up, count the cash, and head home. Maybe he'd heat up some leftovers, watch something mindless on TV. The thought of a quiet night alone was comforting. He had grown to appreciate it. The newcomer, however, seemed out of place. His movements were hurried, almost frantic. Tyrone glanced up, studying him from the corner of his eye. The man's hoodie was pulled low over his face, his hands stuffed deep in the pockets. He was scanning the store, only his eyes weren't focused on the shelves. No, he was looking at something else. Maybe someone. Tyrone didn't tense up, didn't make a move. He had learned long ago that in these kinds of situations, awareness was more important than action. He didn't need to rush into anything. He just needed to observe. It was a skill he had honed over years of deployment, a skill that had kept him alive in places where most men would have been dead before they even knew what hit them. The man's eyes flickered toward Tyrone for a moment, and then he quickly turned away. It was a subtle movement, but it was enough. Something about the way he carried himself felt wrong. The hair on the back of Tyrone's neck stood up. This wasn't going to be an ordinary night. The soft jingling of the bell above the door marked the arrival of another customer, but tonight, Tyrone's instincts told him this was no ordinary customer. As he wiped down the counter, his eyes flicked up to see a figure standing at the entrance of Silver Barrel Liquor. It was nearly closing time, just 30 minutes before Tyrone could lock up and head home for the night. The clock on the wall ticked away steadily, and the store felt like the most predictable place in the world, a sanctuary of calm in the midst of a city that never truly slept. But that peace was about to be shattered. The man who walked in was younger than most of the regulars Tyrone saw at this hour. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face, his posture tense and hurried, as though he was rushing to make a decision. His eyes darted around the store, scanning the aisles, the shelves, but his gaze never settled on any of the bottles of liquor. Instead, it seemed to pass over them like he was searching for something, or perhaps someone. Tyrone noticed the man's hands, shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie, and the slight trembling of his fingers that wasn't subtle enough to go unnoticed. The man's movements were stiff, jerky, almost frantic. Tyrone didn't jump to conclusions, but he'd seen enough in his life to know when something was wrong. The man was acting out of place, He wasn't browsing for a drink or grabbing a late-night snack. There was something in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that Tyrone could feel in his gut. Tyrone kept his distance, never letting his gaze wander too far from the man, but he didn't want to provoke him either. His years of experience in combat had taught him that some people acted out of fear, and fear often made them unpredictable. Tyrone's focus sharpened. He didn't need to do anything dramatic, not yet. The best thing to do in moments like this was to observe and wait for the man to make his move. The store was empty save for Tyrone and the stranger, and the man seemed to notice that too. His gaze flicked around nervously, as if he were unsure about something, a hesitation in his movements. Tyrone caught sight of the register in the corner of the store, the soft green glow of the machine's display providing just enough light to make the moment feel surreal. The atmosphere was heavy, thick with the kind of tension only a veteran like Tyrone could understand. Something was coming. The man suddenly straightened, took a few quick, uneven steps toward the counter, and in one swift motion he pulled his hand from his pocket, revealing a small, cheap-looking gun. Tyrone's eyes locked onto it, his military training kicking in automatically. His heart rate didn't spike. His breath didn't catch. He simply watched the gun, noting the nervous tremor in the man's grip. "Open the register." The man's voice cracked slightly, betraying his anxiety. His words were hurried, desperate, the kind of demand that lacked confidence. He was nervous, so much so that his hands were shaking visibly as he pointed the gun at Tyrone. The weapon was small, a low-end model, but in the hands of a frightened person, it could still cause harm. Tyrone's eyes scanned the gun quickly. A high-point C9. Cheap. Inexperienced. The kind of weapon someone might grab in a moment of desperation but wouldn't have the skill to use effectively. The barrel wobbled slightly as the man gripped it, a sure sign of his unease. It wasn't the gun that posed the real threat. It was the man's state of mind. Tyrone understood that all too well. The man's hand was unsteady, his breath ragged as he took a few more steps forward, closing the distance between them. Tyrone stood still, his gaze unflinching, never breaking contact. His voice came out calm, a contrast to the chaos that was brewing in the other man's mind. "I heard you." Tyrone's tone was even, measured. It wasn't an act of defiance, it was a statement of understanding. He wasn't going to challenge the man right away, not until he understood more about him. There was something about the way the man held the gun, the way his body language spoke of deep fear rather than the cold confidence of someone who had planned this for weeks. Tyrone's eyes remained locked on him, watching his every move. The man's eyes darted nervously from the register to the door, his fingers twitching on the trigger. It was as if he was deciding what to do next, torn between the fear of failure and the growing panic that was overtaking him. Tyrone was well aware that a scared man was more dangerous than a confident one, because they had nothing left to lose. Tyrone didn't make any sudden movements. His hands hovered near the register, but they were slow, deliberate. He wasn't trying to antagonize the man. He was giving him the space to make a choice, to decide what came next. The man licked his lips nervously, his eyes constantly shifting as if he were waiting for something. "Hurry up," he demanded again, his voice quivering with panic. There was a slight quiver in his fingers, the same one Tyrone had noticed before. This wasn't the voice of a seasoned criminal. This was someone who was in way over his head. The fact that the man hadn't pulled the trigger yet was telling. Tyrone could sense it in the air, the hesitation. If this was about violence, the man would have acted already. But instead, he was struggling with something inside of himself, a battle between fear and desperation. "You're nervous," Tyrone said, his voice still calm. "That's bad for both of us." The words hung in the air as if daring the man to respond, to push further, But the response never came. Instead, the man's grip on the gun tightened even more, his fingers turning white around the grip. His breathing became more erratic. Tyrone's eyes remained fixed on the trembling hand, noting every twitch, every minute movement. The man shifted his weight from foot to foot, as if looking for a way out without realizing it. Tyrone observed the subtle movements, the way the man's shoulders were drawn up in tension, the way his knees wobbled slightly. It was all telling. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a man who had reached the edge and had no idea how to step back. Tyrone knew this situation wasn't about the robbery. It was about the man in front of him, about the fear that was controlling his every action. And fear, Tyrone knew, was the hardest thing to predict. The unknown was always dangerous. "You don't want to do this," Tyrone said softly, his voice carrying no judgment, just a quiet, undeniable truth. The man stiffened at the words, his eyes flicking toward the door once more. His fingers twitched on the trigger, but his hand didn't move. Tyrone noticed the hesitation again, and it was becoming more obvious with every passing second. The man's grip on the gun was wrong. Too tight. His knuckles were white, and the veins in his hand were visibly strained. Tyrone recognized the signs of someone who didn't know how to hold a weapon, someone who thought squeezing harder would make them more threatening. The truth was, the tighter the grip, the less control he had. The gun was slipping away from Marcus, not physically but mentally. Tyrone wasn't just looking at the weapon. He was looking at the man holding it, reading his every move, every shift in posture. He could see the cracks, the internal struggle. The man wasn't set on bloodshed. He was stuck, trapped in his own fear and regret. Tyrone could use that, and he would. But not yet. The seconds stretched on, the tension thick in the air. Tyrone's hands stayed where they were still, giving nothing away. He didn't break eye contact, waiting for the moment when the man would finally lose the ability to control himself. That was when the real confrontation would begin. The air in Silver Barrel liquor grew heavier as Marcus held the gun aimed at Tyrone, his body trembling with anxiety. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a harsh, flickering glow over the scene. Tyrone stood still, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. He didn't reach for the register, didn't flinch or show fear. He just watched Marcus, waiting for the next move. Marcus's breath was shallow, coming in quick gasps. His hands, white-knuckled around the gun, shook violently, betraying the fear that had taken root inside him. Tyrone could tell instantly. Marcus wasn't a professional. He wasn't a hardened criminal. He wasn't here for a clean score. He was a man on the edge, a man desperate to solve a problem he had no control over. Tyrone recognized it. The signs were all there. The unsteady gun, the erratic movements, the lack of confidence. It wasn't about the robbery for Marcus. It was about survival. "Open the register now," Marcus demanded again, his voice trembling. This time it was sharper, more forceful, but there was an underlying panic that still made it sound unsure. Tyrone didn't move. He didn't react to the gun in front of him. He simply observed, noting every detail. Marcus wasn't a threat in the way most criminals were. His hands were trembling too much to be threatening. His eyes kept darting back to the door as if he was looking for a way out. Tyrone's experience in Iraq had taught him that fear made people unpredictable, and Marcus was no exception. Fear could make someone dangerous, but it could also make them make mistakes. And mistakes were something Tyrone was counting on. "You don't have to do this," Tyrone said, his voice calm, measured. He took a step forward, not to threaten, but to engage. His eyes stayed locked on Marcus's, offering him the only thing Tyrone could offer in that moment, an opportunity for clarity. "This isn't the way out." Marcus flinched at the words, and his grip on the gun tightened. But Tyrone wasn't done. He could see the tension in Marcus's face, the fear, the confusion. It was all too obvious. This wasn't just a robbery. Marcus wasn't trying to steal. He was trying to escape from something far deeper than the need for money. Tyrone had been there. He knew that kind of desperation. "You think this is the answer?" Tyrone asked, his voice still steady. "You think taking the money will solve your problems?" Marcus hesitated for a moment. The gun wavered slightly in his hand. Tyrone noticed it. The uncertainty was creeping in. For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus didn't look like he knew what he was doing. He looked like a man lost, like someone who had been cornered by life and didn't know how to find a way out. His breathing was heavier now, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The gun wavered again. Tyrone didn't push. He didn't try to grab the gun or make any sudden movements that might set Marcus off. Instead, he took another step forward, closing the distance slowly, purposefully. "You don't want to do this," he repeated. "I know what it's like to be desperate, to feel like you've run out of options." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But this isn't the way." Marcus's eyes flickered toward the door, and Tyrone could tell he was weighing his options. Tyrone knew this moment could go either way. One wrong move, one outburst, and Marcus could lose it entirely. But if Tyrone could keep the calm, keep the pressure on without escalating the situation, there was a chance. Marcus's voice cracked as he repeated his demand. "Open the register. Now." This time it was less sure of itself, almost like a question. The desperation was clear, but so was the doubt. Tyrone didn't hesitate. He responded, "Why? What happens after you take the money? What happens when you walk out of here with a few $100?" His eyes didn't leave Marcus's. He needed him to think, to stop acting on impulse. "What's next?" Marcus froze. For a fraction of a second his grip loosened on the gun. It was barely noticeable, but Tyrone caught it. Marcus wasn't thinking about what came next. He hadn't considered the consequences. All he saw was a way to escape the pressure, the fear that had built up inside him. But now, Tyrone had planted a seed. Marcus's eyes flickered. It was clear that Tyrone's words had given him something to latch onto. Tyrone pressed forward, his voice soft but steady. "You don't want to live like this. You don't want to make a mistake that will follow you the rest of your life." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his foot tapping nervously against the floor. His eyes darted around, looking for answers, looking for something Tyrone wasn't offering. The young man was clearly panicking now. Tyrone had pushed him into a corner, but not in the way Marcus had expected. Instead of lashing out, Tyrone had offered him a path to reconsider his choices. And that was exactly what Marcus needed, time to think. "I don't know what else to do," Marcus muttered under his breath, almost to himself. It was the first real crack in his armor, the first sign of vulnerability Tyrone had seen. The gun wavered in his hand once more, and Tyrone took it as a sign. He needed to keep pushing, gently but with purpose. "There's always another choice." Tyrone's voice remained calm, steady. "You're not trapped. This isn't the only way." Marcus looked at the gun in his hand, then back at Tyrone. His eyes were filled with confusion, with the weight of the decision bearing down on him. "What do I do?" he asked, the words barely escaping his lips. There was a shift. He wasn't the same man who had walked into the store. The power of the situation was starting to slip away from him. Tyrone kept his voice low, soothing. "You walk away. You put the gun down and you start fresh. You don't have to be this person." The words seemed to hang in the air for a long moment. The gun was still aimed at Tyrone, but it wasn't as firm now. The trembling in Marcus's hands was getting worse. Tyrone could see it. The uncertainty was taking hold of him. He was losing his grip on the situation, and that was exactly what Tyrone had been waiting for. Marcus's breath hitched, and Tyrone didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He gave Marcus the space to think. The tension built, but Tyrone could feel it unraveling slowly, bit by bit. The question was no longer whether Marcus would pull the trigger. It was whether Marcus could find the strength to put the gun down and walk away. It was Marcus's choice now. The tension in the room was almost suffocating, a palpable weight that hung between Tyrone and Marcus like a storm cloud ready to burst. The gun was still pointed at Tyrone, but Marcus's grip on it had started to loosen. The trembling of his hand had grown more pronounced, his knuckles now an unhealthy white, his body jerking slightly with each shallow breath he took. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once again, casting an eerie, buzzing glow that made the entire store seem like a place suspended between two realities, one of fear and one of opportunity. Tyrone stood firm, his posture still relaxed but his mind sharp and calculating. He wasn't going to rush this. He knew that rushing would only drive Marcus further into his fear. Instead, he kept the pressure steady, methodical, without any hint of panic. He needed Marcus to see that there was another way, but Tyrone wasn't just speaking with words anymore. His body language, his every glance, every pause, communicated the only message that mattered. You don't have to do this. You're still holding that gun, Tyrone said, his voice steady, almost casual. You don't really want to use it though, do you? The question hung in the air, unanswered, but it was enough to cause a slight shift in Marcus. His eyes darted to the gun in his hand as if he were seeing it for the first time, as if the weight of it suddenly felt heavier. The gun that had once felt like a means to control the situation now seemed like a burden he didn't know how to carry. Marcus's breathing had grown more erratic, quick gasps that punctuated the silence between them. He kept glancing toward the door, but it was like his body was caught between two impulses. His feet were planted, unable to move, but his mind was racing, searching for an answer that would make sense, that would justify his actions. Tyrone watched it all. The small tells, Marcus's eyes flicking to the register and then back to the door, his lips trembling, his breath catching in his throat. These weren't the movements of a man determined to commit an irreversible act. These were the signs of someone who was fighting with themselves, unsure of what to do next. "What are you afraid of?" Tyrone asked, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "You came in here looking for something, right? But this isn't it. This won't fix what's going on in your head." Marcus shifted, the gun lowering for a split second, just enough for Tyrone to catch the hesitation in his stance. His hand wasn't as firm as it had been before. He was wavering, caught between the reality of the situation and the mental block that kept him in place. Tyrone was right. Marcus wasn't here to kill anyone. He was here because he didn't know where else to turn. Tyrone's next words were measured, precise, and they cut through the silence like a knife. "If you wanted to kill me, you would have done it by now." Marcus froze. His grip on the gun faltered for a moment. His eyes darted to Tyrone's face, confusion and disbelief swimming in them. Tyrone knew he'd hit a nerve. It wasn't just a statement, it was a challenge, one that Marcus wasn't ready for. Tyrone had read him, understood him more than he realized. Marcus didn't want to kill anyone. He didn't even want to be here, pointing a gun at another human being. He was just looking for an out, a way to escape a life that had cornered him. "You're not that man." Tyrone's voice softened, and for the first time he took a small step closer. His movements were slow, deliberate, and in that moment Marcus didn't raise the gun. He didn't pull the trigger. He was stuck in his own internal battle, and Tyrone had found the crack in the armor. "You came here thinking it was the only way out, but it's not," Tyrone continued, his eyes never leaving Marcus's. "You don't want to hurt anyone. You're just trying to survive." The silence in the store was oppressive now, every second stretching into eternity. Marcus's hand wavered again, his grip loosening just enough for Tyrone to see the truth. This wasn't about the robbery. This wasn't about taking money or power. This was about Marcus trying to escape the prison of his own mind. The gun, in a way, had become his last attempt at control, a control he had long since lost. Tyrone didn't stop. He kept the pressure on, not to provoke Marcus, but to force him to face the truth. This is the moment, Marcus. The moment where you decide who you are. If you pull that trigger, you'll never be able to take it back. But if you put the gun down, you get a chance to change. Marcus's breathing was shallow now, his eyes wide, his body tense, locked in the decision-making process that would define the rest of his life. Tyrone could see the war playing out in his eyes. On the outside, Marcus looked like a man teetering on the edge of a cliff. On the inside, Tyrone could almost hear the thoughts racing through his mind, thoughts about the mistakes that had led him here, thoughts about what he would lose if he made the wrong choice. "You don't have to live with that weight," Tyrone said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "You don't have to be the man holding the gun. You can walk away from this." For a brief moment, Marcus seemed to collapse in on himself. His shoulders sagged and the gun dropped an inch. Tyrone noticed the subtle shift, and he knew he had the upper hand now. The power dynamic had shifted. The gun wasn't controlling Marcus anymore. His fear was. The tension reached its peak, and for a moment everything seemed to hang in the balance. The air felt thick, suffocating, but then, slowly, Marcus took a deep breath. His fingers twitched again, this time not in fear but in resignation. The gun trembled in his hand, and then, ever so slightly, he lowered it further until it was pointing at the floor. Tyrone didn't make a move. He stayed still, waiting as if he too were holding his breath. Marcus looked down at the gun, his hands shaking as he held it loosely now, almost as if he were waiting for it to fall from his grip entirely. "I can't," Marcus whispered, the words almost lost in the silence. His voice cracked, the weight of his own realization sinking in. Tyrone took another step forward, but this time he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between them was the answer. Marcus's resolve had broken. He wasn't going to shoot, not now, not ever. The gun was still in his hand, but it was no longer a weapon. It was just an object, one that symbolized the fear Marcus had fought against for so long. And now, in that moment, the fight was over. The silence in the liquor store was deafening. Every breath seemed to hang in the air, suspended in the tension that had built between Tyrone and Marcus. The small, flickering fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, their hum almost drowned out by the stillness. Marcus stood there, the gun trembling in his hand, his eyes locked on Tyrone's, the weight of the decision pressing down on him with every passing second. For a long moment, there was no movement. The two men stood in the quiet, an invisible battlefield of will and fear between them. Tyrone could see it. Marcus was at war with himself. His fingers twitched nervously around the grip of the gun, but his body language was different now. He wasn't standing with the same forceful intent as he had when he first entered the store. There was no aggression in his posture. There was only exhaustion, fear, and the slow realization that his actions were leading him down a path he might never return from. Tyrone kept his gaze steady, not out of confrontation, but out of understanding. He wasn't pushing Marcus now. He had already said everything that needed to be said. The rest was up to the man in front of him. It wasn't just about the robbery anymore. It was about what Marcus was going to do with the moment, with the choice that was before him. "You don't have to do this," Tyrone repeated softly, his voice steady but not forceful. "You don't have to live with the weight of this. You're not locked into this path, not yet. You've got a choice." Marcus blinked, his eyes momentarily clouded with confusion. It was as though he couldn't quite comprehend the offer being laid before him. He looked down at the gun in his hand, and for the first time, Tyrone saw a flicker of something, regret, or maybe fear, or perhaps a mix of both. The gun wasn't just an object anymore. It wasn't the answer he had thought it would be. It was heavy, not just physically but emotionally. And Marcus knew it. The young man's breath hitched in his chest, and for a brief moment he seemed as if he were going to pull the trigger, as if he was ready to force himself into a future where he could never take back his actions. But then, the tension in his shoulders loosened, just a fraction, and the trembling in his hand increased, not from fear of Tyrone, but from the realization that he was standing on the edge of something monumental. He had one last chance to change it all. I can't do this," Marcus whispered, more to himself than to Tyrone. His voice cracked, and Tyrone saw the cracks in his resolve widen. Marcus looked at the gun again, the weight of it in his hands now almost unbearable. The moment of truth was upon him. He could walk away, take the first step toward redemption, or he could let fear drive him to do something irreversible. There was no middle ground. Tyrone could see that Marcus was fighting with himself, struggling with the weight of his own regret and confusion. This wasn't about the money. This wasn't about the robbery. It was about Marcus looking at himself, at the choices he had made, and at the possibility of choosing something different. Tyrone took a slow, deliberate step toward him, his movement measured, but he kept a safe distance, never making a threatening gesture. He didn't need to. He had already said enough. He just needed to be there, present, calm, the steadying force in a room that had once been filled with chaos. "It's not too late," Tyrone said, his voice softer now, more personal. "You don't have to carry this with you. What you did doesn't define who you are, Marcus. What you choose to do now does." For a long moment, Marcus's eyes were glued to the floor, the weight of Tyrone's words sinking in. The room was quiet, and the tension seemed to dissipate as Marcus slowly lowered the gun, his fingers still trembling but no longer with the same intensity. Tyrone didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. He had done what he could. The choice was Marcus's to make now. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, Marcus placed the gun on the counter. The act wasn't dramatic, but it was a powerful one. He didn't throw it down, didn't abandon it in anger or frustration. He simply set it down, as if the weight of it had finally become too much for him to bear. Tyrone stayed still, letting Marcus make the final decision in his own time. The tension in the air faded away, leaving only the soft buzz of the lights and the quiet sound of Marcus's breathing. There was no immediate rush to call the police, no sense of urgency in Tyrone's actions. He didn't need to call the authorities. This wasn't about punishment, it was about opportunity, about giving Marcus a chance to choose a different path. "You're making the right choice," Tyrone said, his voice calm and encouraging. "You've got a second chance here, take it." Marcus's eyes met Tyrone's, and for the first time since he had walked into the store, there was a flicker of something else in his gaze. Relief. Uncertainty. But most of all, there was hope. The kind of hope that comes from realizing that it's never too late to change, that even in the darkest moments, there is a way out. Marcus's breath steadied, his hands slowly loosening from their grip on the gun. His shoulders, once tense with fear, seemed to relax just a little, as though the weight of his decision had been lifted. He looked at the gun one last time and then, without a word, he turned toward the door. Tyrone watched him go, his eyes steady, his face unreadable, but inside he felt something he hadn't expected. It wasn't relief. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was something deeper, something more profound. Sometimes all a person needs is a second chance, and sometimes that second chance is the moment that changes everything. Marcus didn't look back as he walked out of the store. His hands were shaking, his body still trembling with the weight of what had just happened, but the gun was no longer in his hand. The door jingled as he exited, and for a moment, the only sound in the store was the soft buzz of the lights overhead. Tyrone stayed behind the counter, the quiet of the store settling around him. He didn't know what Marcus's next step would be. He didn't know if Marcus would take the opportunity to turn his life around or if this moment would just be a brief pause in the chaos of his world. But Tyrone knew one thing. He had given him a chance. And sometimes, that's all a person really needs. The door clicked shut behind Marcus, and Tyrone exhaled slowly, watching the quiet street outside, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories are won not in the heat of battle, but in the calm of a second chance.